So the A&M students came to my house this week, and as they were leaving, we had a bet. And I said, if Texas wins, you guys wear a UT paraphernalia or gear. And I said, if A&M wins, I'll wear an A&M, paraphernalia or gear. And so, for those of you who came to my house, why don't you stand up here? Keith, Andy's wearing, thank you, Andy. Teresa's not wearing anything, nor is Ethan. All right, so, I just guys want to remind you that Texas won 17-7. And when A&M was on the goal line and they didn't score, I felt the Holy Spirit convicting me and saying that I should really not gloat, and I should also love my enemies. I could hear Jesus saying, love my enemies. And so I ended up wearing this for you guys to show you the love of Jesus Christ. And I just want you guys to know from A&M that I will never forsake you, and that my affection, my generosity, and my enduring commitment for you, and Justy's commitment for you, is everlasting, all right? So Harris Kwan gave me this jersey for my 50th birthday. That's why it says 5-0 on there. Okay. So this morning, this passage comes from Matthew chapter 8, verses 1-4. And this is what it reads. It says, when Jesus came down from the mountainside, large crowds followed him. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. I'm willing, he said, be clean. Immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. Then Jesus said to him, see that you don't tell anyone, but go show yourself to the priests and offer the gift Moses commanded as a testimony to them. And all God's people said, amen. All right, so 3 weeks ago, I had the opportunity to go to Portland, Oregon to visit Bible Project. And back in early October, I got a message, an email, and I was invited to be a student in one of their production studios called Classroom. And because I'm a huge Bible Project fan, this was a big deal for me, a very big deal for me. My wife, Justy, told my daughter, Gracie, she said, Gracie, your dad going to Bible Project is equivalent to you getting to spend the week with Taylor Swift. It's that meaningful for him, and she's absolutely 100% correct. And so this morning, what I thought I might do is I thought I might weave together my experiences going to Bible Project and what I learned particularly about this particular passage found in Matthew chapter 8, verses 1-4. Now, for those of you who don't know about Bible Project is a non-profit, crowd-funded tech company. And their vision is to help people see how the Bible is one unified story that leads to Jesus. And Bible Project actually has 3 production studios. They have an animation studio, they have a podcast studio, and they also have a classroom studio. And these studios are meant to provide free resources to Christians to help people understand the Bible as they read the Bible. And the Bible Project is making a huge, incredible impact for the kingdom of God. The Bible Project actually has seen and has released over 200 explainer videos on the Bible, which has been watched by over 100 million times or so. And they actually last year saw 6.1 million YouTube subscribers to their channel across the world. They had over 5,000 translated videos into 50 languages, 2.5 million YouTube version reading plans completed, and 2.4 million monthly podcasts downloaded. And again, I was invited to be part of their classroom production studio. And Classroom is actually this online, platform that allows like this small, intimate kind of class learning to help people learn certain books of the Bible. And they've actually released many different books on the Old Testament. And the whole point of Classroom is to help people read the scriptures together in community. Well, last year, they actually had over 1 million people complete Classroom sessions. But this year, they're going to actually launch a new series of classes, of which Tim Mackey is actually going to be going through the Gospels in the New Testament. And so sometime this month, they're going to be releasing classes on the Gospel of Matthew, with the first class being Matthew chapter 1 through 4, which is called The Rise of the Messiah. The second class will be released sometime next year called Matthew chapter 5 through 7, which will be the Beatitudes, the teachings of the Messiah. And I was selected to be a student along with 5 other students to go through Matthew chapter 8 through 10, which will actually be released sometime at the end of next year and maybe at the beginning of 2026. And actually, this was our class. Half of our class was made up of U.S. citizens. In the middle there is a senior pastor from Colorado. Her name is Teresa. There was a layman who is standing next to Tim Mackey. His name is Matthew from Virginia. And it was myself from Texas. And the other half of students were actually translators from outside of the United States, such as Carolina from Finland, or Erica from Indonesia, and Lucas from Brazil, all whom have been translating Bible Project videos within their respective countries. And what happened was a couple of translators at the last minute had to drop out. And by the complete grace of God, I was invited and selected to come and participate. In fact, actually, I was invited this past April, but when I looked at my schedule, I noticed that, and my heart just fell into my stomach because life coaching was scheduled that same week as their classroom class. And so I had to decline and say no because I wanted to be together with Group 15. But I told them to please ask me again. And so surprisingly, they contacted me again this fall. And I was so elated when they contacted me, and I said, yes, I'm going. And so this classroom, on Matthew 8 through 10 started the week of November the 10th. Well, 6 of us students then got to sit down with Tim Mackey at this table, where he pointed out certain observations within Matthew that we might not have seen while reading, the Gospel of Matthew. And it was really like going to a mini Bible camp. The only catch was that Tim Mackey taught us while we were being filmed on camera for 2 whole days, from 8 to 5 p.m. I had to wear the same clothes for 2.5 days, with an extra day needed for half day needed for extra footage. But it was still so awesome. I got to directly ask Tim Mackey all sorts of questions. And it was so strange because when I was there in Portland, every night I only got about 4 hours of sleep. I don't know if I was anxious or what, but I only could sleep 4 hours a night. So I ended up asking Tim Mackey so many dumb questions. So many dumb questions. You'll notice me on the video just pausing, trying to ask a question. And here I think I'm asking Tim Mackey, why couldn't Jesus be Korean or something like that? So, but Tim, he was, a very warm-hearted, very nice person, very polite, and he answered all my questions. And actually there's this saying, I don't know if you've heard this saying, that people from the East Coast are not nice, but they're kind. People from the West Coast are nice, but they're not kind. And people from the South are both nice and kind. So going to Portland, going to Bible Project, I was super curious to see what these people at Bible Project are like. And I was curious to know whether, what their culture was like, how the people interact. And since they're from the Northwest, are they nice but not kind people? But I have this funny story that I have to tell you. It was very odd because every time I went to the men's washroom, Tim Mackey would so happen to show up beside me. I guess we were on the same washroom cycle, if you will. And I remember the first time this happened to me, he just started talking to me, and he said, hey, Sang, so you're from Houston, and you go to a church called New Life, and you're in seminary. And we just started talking, and we started talking more. And we had this very casual conversation as we're walking out the bathroom, continuing to talk. Well, the second day, the exact same thing happened again. We coincidentally were in the washroom with each other. And we started talking again. And we're walking out of the washroom, and he said, hey, come with me. And we're headed to the studio. And he said, just come with me real quick. And so I walk with him, and he says, I'm going to take you into my office real quick. So I walk into his office, right? And I'm in his office, and right next to him in his office is John Collins. they share an office together. And he says, hey, do you know John? And I said, yeah, I met John last night. And immediately, I pull out my camera, and I asked him to take a selfie on camera. And I said, actually the whole week I started using my Asian card. I was like, because I'm Asian, I have to take as many pictures as possible. I'm so sorry. I'm obligated to take pictures. And I took this shot with me, Tim, and John. And so Tim and I, we say goodbye to John, and we walk out to the studio, just like normal people. And from that incident, I realized just how down to earth these people are, and they're trying to be. Tim invited me to his office, right? He's just a down-to-earth guy, very normal, trying to be like Jesus. They're not trying to be, stuck-up, famous people, and it made an impression on me. Well, the third day, I so happened to be in the washroom again, and coincidentally, Tim walks in. And by the way, I was in the washroom first, all right? It wasn't the other way around where I actually was walking in. I wasn't stalking Tim, okay, in the bathroom. It just so happened that he walked in. If I was stalking him, that would be very creepy. But I ended up, he comes into the restroom and he goes, here we are again. He says, the great equalizer, the restroom. And I said, hey, I have a funny story to tell you. This exact same thing happened to me with Matt Damon. I was in my 20s, and I was at a hotel, an expensive hotel for a friend's wedding. And lo and behold, Matt Damon comes up right beside me, next to me in the stall. And I look over, and I double take. And I'm looking at Matt Damon the whole time. The whole time. And he could feel me staring at him, right? And of course, I'm not saying anything to Matt Damon, and of course, Matt Damon is not saying anything to me, But I told Tim this story, and I said, Tim, thank you so much for talking to me, because had you not started initiating a conversation with me, I would never have initiated a conversation with you, And so I said, thank you, and we started talking some more, and I learned from that experience that, people who intensely study Jesus, they have to become like Jesus. People who intensely study Jesus have to become like Jesus. They must be willing to encounter people, and they must be personal. And honestly, I was expecting to go to Bible Project and just spend 2 days of filming and immediately just leave. And honestly, that would have been enough for me. Just going there just to shoot the 2 days and just leave. But what I experienced there was this culture of people being both nice and kind. And people there were really trying to make us feel like we're part of the family, feel part of the community, and it was just a great time. And this is actually a picture of the entire production team for Classroom. Most of these people, they work with Katrina, who is a member of our church. And they didn't even know that I actually knew Katrina until I got there. And I thought that Katrina originally helped me to get onto Bible Project, but she didn't. It was totally by the grace of God that I ended up getting there. And this team of Bible Project people, they really love Katrina, they really respect her work, and they're really together, they're truly living out, what it means to, live out being affectionate and generous people. Bible Project, they pay for all my expenses. They paid for my airfare, my hotel, my food, my Uber rides, and on top of that, they gifted me with all this great merchandise, this merch. And they actually, the last day I opened up, a gift that they gave me, and it was a limited edition print of the Tree of Life. And I had already posted that on Instagram for those of you who've seen it, or on Facebook. But when I received it, I told them, I said, did you guys know? This is my favorite Bible Project video. And this story of the Tree of Life, this means so much to me. And obviously, they had no idea, It just so happened to work out that way. So again, another God thing. So God was really, his hand was really guiding me as I went there. Anyways, what was really great is I didn't see these Bible Project people with just a bunch of head knowledge. They were really people that were very genuine. They were meek, they were kind, they were humble, and just really hospitable people. And it really made it really, really easy for me to actually learn what Tim was going to teach me for the next 2 days. Now, before going to Portland, I was super curious to see how Tim Mackey was going to teach us 3 chapters in Matthew while taking 2 whole days of filming. But it was so incredible. It was so incredible to watch him unpack so much within these just mere 3 chapters. And in my opinion, there could have been another full entire day of just him going through Matthew chapter 10, Jesus' commissioning of the disciples. And just within 3 chapters, Tim unpacked themes like Israel and the nations and cosmic reality, spiritual evil, chaos, sickness, and moral failure or sins. He talked about discipleship and the type of disciples Jesus was calling to himself. He talked about the sending out of the disciples for ministry. He talked about faith in Jesus and trusting in Jesus. And most importantly, he talked about Jesus encountering different types of people throughout his ministry. And Tim actually starts off with this in the class with what I believe he and the Bible Project does really great. He starts off with an overview of Matthew 8 through 10 in order to give us a map over this entire gospel. And he started by showing us this chart, which is an overview of Matthew 8 through 9. And then he stated that Matthew has deliberately structured chapter 8 through 9 with 3 sets of signs and wonders, with Jesus doing a total of 10 signs. He points out that in between these 3 sets, there are 2 commercial breaks where Jesus actually calls his disciples with the phrase, "Come and follow me." So this means that Matthew is pointing out that Jesus is not just out there to perform a bunch of signs and wonders, but he's actually calling and he's preparing his disciples to do the ministry themselves. And Matthew chapter 10 will just be this speech of Jesus commissioning the disciples to go out into the local towns and villages to do ministry. Of course, we're not going to be able to go through all of this, through the whole literary structure, but today I thought I'd give you just a taste of what I was taught within these 4 verses found in Matthew chapter 8. The story is only 4 verses long, but there's so much going on in this particular story. Starting with the man with leprosy. You see, the first thing that I learned that from this story was that this man who approached Jesus had a skin disease. He had a skin disease. However, this skin disease is not the same leprosy that maybe we would think of in our modern day and age. When we think of leprosy, we often think of Hansen's disease. Hansen's disease really affects the nerves, it affects your skin, it affects your eyes and the lining of your nose. And with Hansen's disease, many of us think of severe cases that can lead to nerve damage, particularly in your hands and in your feet, like you actually see on this screen. And in Greek, there's a Greek word for Hansen's disease called nlfhtx. By the way, when I was with Tim Mackey, I looked over at his Bible, and he only reads from the Greek Bible in the New Testament. It's incredible. And I was like, whoa. And then he pointed out, this word, lepros, in Greek, in this passage, which gets translated into English as leprosy. But lepros is a general term that equates to a person with some sort of skin infection. All right? So it's very general in terms of his term. So in fact, Jesus at the time, he wants to touch a person with a skin infection, like a rash or hives, or a person with noticeable eczema could be considered a person with lepros. Now, the reason why knowing the background for the word lepros was important for me to know is because my son has severe eczema. In fact, my son every month has to take an injection to keep his eczema at bay. And if my son does not take these regular shots, his skin can get really, really irritated and flaky. And this is actually a past picture of my son when he was around 11 years old. And so, back in the days of Jesus, my son would be considered a person with perpetual lepros. So, this story got just a little bit more personal to me. I could see my son, Eli, coming up to Jesus. Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. So this leads me to the next thing I learned from this passage while I was in this class. That secondly, this man with lepros wanted something more than just being healed of his skin disease. When you look at the Gospels, Most people who approached Jesus, they just wanted some sort of healing of some type. Something, a healing of their physical body, or maybe even someone else's body, such as the woman with perpetual bleeding, the blind man, the paralytic, a centurion who wanted to have his servant healed, a synagogue leader whose daughter had died, and so on and so forth. But what's very interesting is that there are many words in Greek to describe the word healing. There's so many different types of word for healing that Matthew does not use in this story. Matthew actually uses a word instead of the word healing. He uses the word purified or be made clean. And the point is that this skin disease man was looking for something more than just healing. This man was intentionally coming to Jesus looking to be made clean or pure. Now, when Tim Mackey got to this point, he started drawing on his iPad. And he drew this picture like this, with two boxes labeled holy and common. He said for an Israelite, there's two main state conditions when it comes to their position before God. One state condition was called holy. So anything that could be accepted before God's presence was considered holy or set apart for God. But the other state condition was called common. Common just means that things are not set apart for God. So for example, this spoon here, this spoon can be considered just common. But here's the deal. A common spoon can become impure or unclean if it were to touch something related to death or representative of death. So for example, if this spoon touched a dead animal carcass, then it would be considered an impure or unclean spoon. And the same goes with the human body. According to the book of Leviticus, if a hand touches a dead carcass, then that person would be considered unclean for a certain period of time. It'd be someone like maybe, David Yee there. If he picked up a dead squirrel, he would be considered unclean or impure for a certain period of time. Most likely David's 7 days of quarantining for you. David loves picking up dead squirrels. So, this doesn't mean that you are a person of moral failure. It doesn't mean that you're a person of moral failure. It just means that you have touched death, and you cannot enter God's presence because God's presence represents life, pure, 100% life. And according to Numbers 5, verse 2, there are three things that puts a person in an unclean state. Number one is skin disease. Number two is, bodily discharge of some sort. And number three is a person who has come in contact with the dead. Now, I just want you to know that this is not entirely rational here. But we actually do the kind of same irrational behaviors in our modern culture. So for example, if you were to take your dinner and eat it while you're near the toilet, or maybe while you're sitting on the toilet, that would just feel wrong, right? Eating your dinner near the toilet or sitting on the toilet. However, you brush your teeth near the toilet. And some of you brush your teeth, I know, sitting on the toilet, right? So it's not entirely rational here. And the same goes for the ancient Israelites. So we have to note that there's a principle. There's a symbolic principle here that things of death cannot mix with things of life, pure life. And this skin diseased man, he would be considered an impure or unclean, in an unclean state for a certain period of time until that disease went away. But what happens? What happens if that disease never went away? What happens if that disease stayed with you the rest of your life? It would mean that you could never come near the presence of God. It would mean that you were ousted from the worshiping community of believers. It would mean that the people around you would avoid touching you or even hugging you, because if they hugged you, then you would put them in an impure state. It would mean that you have to continue distancing yourself from the social community of worshipers. It would be equivalent to my son Eli at the age of 11 years old to perpetually be forced not to come to church simply because of his eczema. In fact, in Numbers 5:2-3, the passage continues to detail how the Israelites were traveling through the camp. And a person with lepros would have to move outside the camp as they're traveling toward the promised land. And in the Numbers, it says, command the Israelites to send away from the camp anyone who has a defiling skin disease or a discharge of any kind, or who is ceremonially unclean because of a dead body. Send away male and female alike. Send them outside the camp so they will not defile their camp where I dwell among them. So if you could just imagine for a second, with my son Eli at the age of 11 years old with perpetual eczema, my whole family would have to be moved and accompany him outside of the camp as we headed toward the promised land together. And if you can imagine, I'm sure that Eli, as the rest of our family, we would have this feeling of disappointment, hurt, possibly bitterness, shame, and most of all, this feeling of disconnection from the rest of the community and the presence of God, especially the presence of God, which was being represented by the Ark of the Covenant in the middle. You see, for a person with perpetual lepros, their deepest desire would be just to be part of the worshiping community again and to be close to God's presence one more time. So here, Tim Mackey, what he does is he points out that this skin disease man in Matthew chapter 8, verses 1 through 4, comes before Jesus and he bows before him. And he's bowing before the temple of God. And he says to Jesus, if you're willing, you can make me pure, or you can make me clean. And this actually leads me to the last thing that I learned from this very, very short passage. I learned about the power of Jesus' touch. I learned about the power of Jesus' touch. What is strange is that Jesus immediately says he's willing. And instead of Jesus kind of avoiding this skin disease man, Jesus does something that's really unheard of for an Israelite. Jesus does the exact opposite. If you look at verse 3, the verse states that Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. In fact, if you look at verse 3, the verse states that Jesus reached out his hand and touched him, but this word reached out means he stretched out his hand. He stretched out his hand in order to touch the man. And again, here is what, I really believe the Bible Project does so well. Tim, he zooms out, and it's almost like he's flying a drone that is looking at this particular story with Jesus and this skin disease man. And then he controls the drone to ascend higher, looking down at the surrounding passages at this particular story. And he points out other connections to other stories where Jesus uses his hand to touch people. Then Tim reminds us that the story of the skin disease man is the first story in Matthew where Jesus uses his hand to actually touch people. And he draws our attention to the fact that at the beginning of this particular story, Jesus is coming down from the mountain. Like when Moses is coming down from the mountain in the book of Exodus after being in God's presence. It's as if Jesus is carrying with him God's holy presence. And Jesus just starts to touch people with his life. In fact, there's another story that you'll see in Matthew 9:20 of a woman who is impure because she has been bleeding for 12 years. She said to herself, if I can only touch Jesus' garment, I will be healed. And the Greek word that she uses here is the word rescued. I'll be rescued if I touch his garment. And when she touches his garment, Jesus turns to her and says, take heart, my daughter, he said. Your faith has rescued you. And the woman was rescued at that moment. So, it's as if instead of avoiding people, Jesus is actually going out and he's rescuing people, saving people by touching people with God's presence. One commentator said this when he wrote about the Gospel of Matthew. He said, Jesus frequently touched those whom he healed, but the additional expression, stretched out his hand, here focuses attention on the act, which is specifically significant in the case of a skin diseased man. To touch an unclean person was to contract defilement to oneself. So there's something about Jesus' touch that allows him to enter into God's presence of a holy God again. So Jesus seems to be carrying a holy contagion. Now, here is a video that I'd like to show you from Bible Project to kind of give you a better glimpse of kind of what's going on here. And for those of you who've not seen a Bible Project video, maybe this might be your first one. So if I could cue the video from the multimedia team.
You've probably heard the word holy before, or at least sang it in a church song once or twice. And for most people, this idea is really just connected to being a morally good person. So God is holy because he's morally perfect.
Yeah, that is part of it. But in the Bible, the idea of holiness is even bigger and more rich. What it's really describing is how God is the creative force behind the whole universe. He's the one and only being with the power to make a world full of such beauty and life. And so all these abilities, they make God utterly unique, which is the meaning of the word holy. So a helpful way to think about God's holiness is by using the sun as a metaphor. The sun is unique, at least within our solar system, and it's really powerful. It's the source of all this beautiful life on our planet. And so you could say that the sun is holy. And you can actually take this metaphor even further in that the whole area around the sun is also holy.
Yeah, because the closer you get to the sun, the more intense it gets.
Yeah, exactly. So that very power and goodness that generates all this life is also dangerous. I mean, the sun, if you get too close, will annihilate you. And in the same way, there's this paradox at the heart of God's own holiness, because if you're impure, his presence is dangerous to you. And not because it's bad, but because it's so good. And so the first time we see this paradox of God's holiness, it's in the story of Moses and the burning bush.
So God tells Moses to take off his sandals because he's standing on holy ground. And Moses covers his face in fear, and God says, hey, don't come any closer. It's intense.
It's actually that intensity of God's holiness that's explored even more in the stories about Israel's temple, which was the main place where God's holy presence was located. And at the center of the temple was this room called the most holy place, the hot spot of God's presence. And whether you're an Israelite living in the land around the temple or a priest working right in the temple, you're in proximity to God's holy presence, which is dangerous.
Yeah, this is a problem. So how's it supposed to work?
Well, in the Bible, the solution is that you need to become pure.
So like being morally pure.
Yeah, and that's easy enough to understand. But the Bible spends a lot of time talking about another kind of purity, being ritually pure, which is a state where you separate yourself from anything related to death, like touching things like diseased skin or dead bodies or even certain bodily fluids. All these make you impure. And becoming ritually impure isn't necessarily sinful. What's wrong is waltzing into God's presence when you're in an impure state. And so that's why God gave the Israelites very clear instructions for knowing when they were impure, steps to become pure, so that they could go into the temple again.
So that's what the book of Leviticus is about.
Right. But it doesn't stop there. This idea keeps developing. So later in the scriptures, we find this really interesting story by a prophet named Isaiah. And he has this crazy vision where he's in the temple and he's right in God's presence. He's totally terrified.
Yeah, he knows the rules. He shouldn't even be in there. And he's worried about being destroyed.
And then this crazy creature called a seraphim.
Yeah, that is a crazy creature.
Totally. So it flies over with a hot coal, and then it sears Isaiah's lips with the coal and says something really weird. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin is atoned for.
So this burning coal somehow makes Isaiah pure.
Yeah, it's remarkable because normally if you touch something impure, it transfers its impurity to you. But now here's this new idea where you have this coal, this very holy and pure object, and it touches Isaiah, and it transfers its purity to him. Isaiah is not destroyed by God's holiness. He's transformed by it. I mean, the implications of this are just huge. But there's one more development, this time from another prophet, Ezekiel. And he has this vision where he's standing at the temple and he sees water trickling out from it. And then that water turns into a stream, and then it grows into a deep river that starts flowing through the desert, leaving this trail of green trees behind it. And then it flows into the Dead Sea, making everything fresh and alive.
So instead of becoming pure first and then going into the temple, here God's holiness comes out from the temple, making things pure and bringing them to life. what does it all mean?
So we don't know until we meet this man, Jesus. And he claims that he's fulfilling all of these ancient visions, but in surprising new ways. So Jesus, he went around touching people who are impure, people with skin diseases, a woman with chronic bleeding, or dead people. And when he touches them, their impurity should transfer over to Jesus, but instead, Jesus' purity transfers to them and actually heals their bodies.
Jesus is like that holy coal in Isaiah's vision.
Right. And Jesus claimed that he was the human embodiment of God's own holiness, and that he and his followers were now God's temple, so that through them, God's holy presence would go out into the world and bring life and healing and hope. And so this is why Jesus described his followers as having streams of living water flowing out of them.
So this is our part of the story where we find ourselves now, but where's this all heading?
So the last pages of the Bible end with a final vision about God's holiness. And this time it's by a guy named Chon. And in his vision, we see the whole world made completely new. The entire earth has become God's temple. And Ezekiel's river is there, flowing out of God's presence, immersing all of creation, removing all impurity, and bringing everything back to life.
All right, thank you. All right, so you see there's something we learn from this video. There's something about Jesus' touch that makes people pure and clean again. And there's something about Jesus' touch that allows people to enter into their social worshiping community and also into God's presence. I'm going to leave you with 3 implications and 3 applications from this particular passage. 3 implications and 3 applications. First, while disease is a form of death, so is sin. While disease is a form of death, so is sin. Sin is a form of death. In this classroom, Tim, in other stories that he goes through with us, he shows us the connection, how spiritual evil, disease, and sin are all interconnected because they are in association with death. And so, sin is a form of death, the opposite of holiness. And for some of us, sometimes when we sin, our first response is that I need to avoid God, and I need to avoid Jesus. When we take on sin, we often don't want to ever come near the presence of God. And certainly, we sometimes don't want to come to church because when we come to church, we feel so dirty and unclean. Just like Isaiah, when he was in the presence of God in Isaiah chapter 6, he says, "Woe is me, woe is me." And sometimes we feel like that. But this is, in fact, the exact opposite of Jesus' purpose of coming here on earth. Jesus' mission was to come and to touch you. He was to come and touch you. Jesus does not want you to avoid him, but he wants you to come to him. He wants to come and make you clean and purified, no matter how unclean you and I feel. We should always want to come before Jesus because Jesus is always willing. The second thing that we learn is that Jesus' compassion, his compassion doesn't give us a license to sin. It doesn't give us a license to remain impure or unclean. This idea of Jesus' holiness being contagious, coming upon you and me, is meant to show us that he's transforming us from the inside out. And his main goal is that you and I can live as children of God. The Lord actually states in Isaiah 1:18, he says this, "Come now, let us settle the matter, says the Lord. Though your sins are like scarlet, they shall be as white as snow. Though they are red as crimson, they shall be like wool." So our lives here on earth are under reconstruction. We're going through a process of sanctification. We are becoming holy or set apart for God by being his children. And the third thing that we can take away from this is finally for the others of us. Jesus wants us to go out not trying to avoid people with this risk that they are going to contaminate us or make us unclean, but rather with the confidence that you and I can go out and spread his contagious holiness. In classroom, we later got to Matthew chapter 10, verse 7, where Jesus actually makes a speech to his disciples. And he says, as you go, proclaim this message. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have skin disease, drive out demons. Freely you have received, freely give. So what is actually Jesus charging us to do? He's charging us to go out and to touch somebody. Go out and touch someone. Spread his holy contagion through touching other people. Don't go out expecting that you're going to be infected by the world, but rather go out and meet those people so that you can spread his holiness. His holiness is power is over impurity. God's presence is passed on to other people. And as you saw in that last scene of that video, it's through the Holy Spirit, the filling of the Spirit, and with faith in God that we can actually spread Jesus' holy contagion. And this is why I believe house church is so important. It's so important. What a great way to have a super spreader effect in house church with a group of 6 to 10 people that get together to spread Jesus' contagious holiness to other people, to VIPs. So let me ask you a question. Is there someone in your life this Advent season that Jesus is asking you to go out and touch, to bring them to God? Let's not forget that Jesus in our life has power, right? And that we can actually spread his holy contagion to the world. So let's pray together.